Today I'm going to show you how to turn a cheap vintage lens that doesn't focus to infinity into a macro lens. Hey everyone, Sean here with Fotodiox, and here is a little lens I picked up in a bargain bin at a camera store in London. I was out traveling there. Picked up some nicer stuff at the store, but I thought it would be fun to pick up this tiny little, almost like a pancake lens. It's a 35mm Solagore f3.5. So yeah, it's not very fast, which makes sense that it was in the bargain bin. And unfortunately, this lens does not focus to infinity. When I mount it on our Fotodiox M42 to Sony E adapter, it should be able to work on my Sony camera. It should be able to focus to infinity and work just like any other manual lens. But unfortunately, even when I set it to infinity focus, it only focuses up to about 10 to 15 feet. It doesn't focus any farther. Now, I'm not really sure what is going on with this lens. I suppose I could take it apart and try to modify it. But in the meantime, I thought, why not use this lens to shoot macro photos? Now, this lens is not a macro lens. Its minimum focusing distance is only 3 feet. But we can turn this lens into a macro lens with our Fotodiox Macro extension tubes. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to mount this lens on the front of this macro tube, then mount the macro tube to our Sony E camera. And by extending the distance between the lens's optic and the camera's sensor, we're going to make this lens be able to focus extremely close up to be able to macro focus. Now, this is an M42 threaded lens, and this is a Sony E-mount macro tube. So to get this lens to mount onto this macro tube, we're actually going to use this adapter. So we're just going to swap out the spacing. So we're going to put the M42 lens back onto our M42 to Sony E adapter. And like I showed, I wasn't able to get infinity focus with this adapter and lens, but that's okay because we don't need infinity focus. We're just going to mount this adapter onto our Sony E macro extension tube like that. And then we're going to mount the macro extension tube onto our Sony E camera. As you can see, we've extended this lens way, way farther than it should be from the sensor. And now we can focus super close up. Now, I actually didn't use this exact combination for my macro photos because I found with the full extension of this tube, the macro focus was actually too intense. I was only able to focus on very, very small things, and I had to get the lens pretty close to do so. But that's okay because our Fotodiox macro extension tubes are customizable. They actually come with various spacer rings of different lengths, and you can actually choose how much spacing you want. So as you can see here, we've got the rear mount, we've got the front mount, but then we have a 28mm spacer, a 14mm spacer, and a 7mm spacer. And for the majority of my photos, I actually only needed the 14mm and the 7mm spacer. I did not need the 28. So let's just remove that. As you can see, these all thread apart. So you can customize the length of your macro extension tube. Yeah, so for most of my macro photos with this lens, I was just using this shorter spacing. Lock it to the macro tube. Once again, put it on the camera. There we go. This is much shorter, and it is giving me the correct amount of macro focus that I need for the majority of my photos. So I used this lens macro tube camera combo to capture some flower photography while I was in London. I was in St. James Park. I also used it to capture some insect photography. Now, this isn't a super fast lens, but that's actually okay with macro photography because the more macro extension you put between your lens and camera, the more shallow the focus is going to be of your lens. So you're actually going to want to stop it down. So in the case of these settings, I think I was shooting at mostly f5.6. Actually, I think I was shooting mostly at f8. So for most of these photos, I actually had the lens set to f8. And even at f8, it's a fairly shallow focus. But it's better than shooting at f3.5. At f3.5, only a very, very tiny amount of the photos were in focus and everything else was out of focus. So when you're shooting with a macro extension tube, you're generally going to want to shoot at a narrower aperture. Now this brings up some issues. With a narrower aperture, and also because the macro tube is reducing the amount of light that's going to hit your sensor, you do have to shoot at a slower shutter speed. And this can be a problem if there's wind blowing the flowers or if you are not using a tripod. Blessedly, with this Sony a7S II, that's not a problem because this camera is super sensitive. It has a really high ISO. So I was able to bump all the way up to like 4,000 ISO and even a little bit higher, so I could use a faster shutter speed. Now, not all cameras are going to give you this option. If you're using a higher megapixel camera, if its sensor isn't as sensitive, you will probably have to use a tripod to be able to shoot at slower shutter speeds. And the other thing you can do is you can bring in miniature LED light or flash with diffusers to light your subject. But in this case, I was just doing a very simple setup. I was just using available natural light and our Fotodiox Macro Tube to capture these images. Another cool thing you can do is focus stacking. I did a very primitive focus stacking shot here. I was photographing this small insect and I was trying to get it in focus, kind of moving the camera back and forth. And you can see with these 3 photos, I focused on different parts of the bug. I was able to stack these images in Photoshop, stack them so that they aligned. I used the auto feature, and then I used the blend feature to blend these 3 photos together. Now, like I said, this is very primitive focus stacking. You can go much more complex. You can use internal focus stacking in your camera. You can take like 20 photos, moving the camera back and forth to get a much deeper focus on your macro subject. But for what I was doing, 3 photos worked fine. Okay, that's a quick look at using our macro extension tubes with cheap manual lenses to create an affordable macro lens. If you have any questions or comments about this setup or anything I said in today's video, comment below. I'd love to help you out. Also, click the link in the description below to learn more about our Fotodiox Macro Tubes and all the different cameras and lens mounts we offer them for. Plus, click right here to subscribe to our YouTube channel to get more videos just like this one. I'm Sean with Fotodiox.com, and happy macro photography.